Cotton produced by the labor of enslaved African Americans was so profitable, it took a costly civil war and the loss of over 600,000 lives to end it. Dunbar, with the Black Timeline. Cotton was king. The deadliest war ever fought on American soil. More than the number of U.S. military deaths in all other wars combined. The Civil War was the result of years of tension between the northern and southern states. The election of Abraham Lincoln was the final trigger for the southern states to withdraw from the federal government, proclaiming themselves an independent nation. The northern states that remained loyal to the federal government were known as the Union. The southern states that declared their withdrawal from the country were known as the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy was formed by 7 slave states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Main causes: states' rights, westward expansion, slavery. Slavery is considered the central cause of the Civil War. Westward expansion and states' rights meet right back at slavery. In the North, manufacturing and industry were well established, the main center of manufacturing, commerce, and finance, not much agriculture. The South's economy was based on a system of large-scale farming that depended on the labor of enslaved African Americans to grow cash crops: sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton. By hand, an enslaved person could pick the seeds out of 10 pounds of cotton a day. The cotton gin could process 100 pounds in a day. So, the cotton gin should reduce the need of enslaved African Americans due to its 10 times performance. No. It led to increased demand. Production and distribution were amped up. The number of plantations expanded. Production exploded. And the domestic slave trade was in full effect. Until the American Civil War, cotton was the South's primary product. Southern cotton dominated the global cotton supply, controlling 75% of the market. By 1860, right before the American Civil War, cotton accounted for around 60% of American exports, a total value of around $200 million a year. $200 million in 1860 is equivalent to about $7 billion today. Big business. Control over cotton exports would make the Confederacy economically independent. Because of their dependence on Southern cotton, its end would ruin the textile industry of New England and would force the United Kingdom and France to support the Confederacy. Those dreams were crushed. The Union Navy blockaded every major Confederate port and shut down 95% of exports. States' rights. The South argued that just as each state decided to join the Union, a state had the right to leave the Union at any time. Laws were starting to interfere with the South's right to keep slaves, and the South wanted to keep that right. The North denied that notion as going against the will of the Founding Fathers, who said they were setting up a permanent union. Westward expansion. Would slavery be allowed in the newly purchased Western territories? What the hell was that? I don't know what the hell that was. It felt good at the time. Would slavery be allowed in the newly purchased Western territories? The expansion of slavery into the Western territories entered congressional debate. The first great expansion of the country was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which doubled the country's territory. The new lands were attractive to cotton farmers who wanted to expand to meet the increasing demand for cotton. The demand led to the price of enslaved African Americans going up close to 300%. By 1850, there were 3.2 million enslaved African Americans in the slave states, and 1.8 million of them were picking cotton. The value of the 4 million enslaved African Americans in 1860 was, on average, $1,000 per person, or about $4 billion total. That was more than all the banks, railroads, and factories in the U.S. were worth at the time. In today's money, that would be over $42 trillion, accounting for inflation and compound interest. There were slave-backed securities, bonds with enslaved African Americans as collateral. Enslaved African Americans were used as collateral for mortgages. The federal government, hoping to prevent a civil war, temporarily resolved the westward expansion disagreements with compromises. The Missouri Compromise was made to balance out the free states and the slave states among the newly obtained western territories of the Louisiana Purchase. It boiled down to whether the North or the South would have more seats in Congress, leading to more power. As the compromises appeared to become more one-sided, the North and the South became more divided. The domestic slave trade. The internal slave trade that took place in the United States, fueled by the demand for cotton. Around 388,000 African Americans were taken from Africa, transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. Around 1 million enslaved African Americans were transported internally in the U.S. from the Upper South to the Lower South. Since the slave trade from Africa was ended in 1808, enslaved African Americans in the Upper South had become extremely valuable. Even though the U.S. banned the importation of the enslaved from Africa, the high demand for slave labor from the booming cotton trade encouraged illegal slave runs to Africa. The last known slave ship to arrive in the United States in 1860, Clotilda. It sailed from Mobile, Alabama, and imported around 110 enslaved African Americans to Alabama about 50 years after the slave trade was outlawed. The years between 1830 and 1860 were the worst in the history of African American enslavement. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln made his position clear. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. He stated that he opposed black people having the right to vote, to serve on juries, to hold office, and to intermarry with whites. What he did believe was that, like all men, black men had the right to improve their conditions in society and to enjoy the fruits of their labor. In this way, they were equal to white men, and for this reason, slavery was inherently unjust. For much of his career, Lincoln believed that colonization, the idea that a majority of the African American population should leave the United States and settle in Africa or Central America, was the best way to confront the problem of slavery. His two great political heroes, Henry Clay and Thomas Jefferson, had both favored colonization. Both saw no way that black and white people could live together peaceably. Emancipation was a military strategy, war tactic, and it did not free all enslaved people. It didn't apply to border slave states, which were loyal to the Union. Lincoln thought emancipation would further cripple the Confederacy while providing the Union with a new source of manpower against the rebellion. African Americans and the Civil War. 186,097 African Americans joined the Union Army. Around 20% of them lost their lives during the Civil War. African American soldiers were placed in segregated units, few of which saw action in battle, and their regiments were commanded by white men. They were paid less and were issued equipment that was older or poorly made. They also faced a threat that no white troop faced. When they were captured by the rebels, African American troops could be put into enslavement, whether they had been free or enslaved before the proclamation. They also suffered harsher treatment if they were held as prisoners of war. Abolitionist Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts issued the Civil War's first official call for African American. Abolitionist Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts issued the Civil War's first official call for African American soldiers. They formed the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first African American regiment. Medal of Honor. The first African American recipient of the Medal of Honor was Army Sergeant William H. Carney, earning the honor for protecting one of the United States' greatest symbols during the Civil War, the American flag. On July 18, 1863, the soldiers of Carney's regiment led the charge on Fort Wagner. During the battle, the unit's flag bearer was shot. Carney, who was just a few feet away, saw the dying man stumble, and he hurried to catch the falling flag. Despite suffering several serious gunshot wounds himself, Kearny kept the flag held high as he crawled up the hill to the walls of Fort Wagner, urging his fellow troops to follow him. He planted the flag in the sand at the base of the fort and held it upright until his near-lifeless body was rescued. He didn't give up. Many witnesses said Kearny refused to give the flag to his rescuers, holding onto it tighter until, with assistance, he made it to the Union's barracks. These men did such things as took command after a commanding officer was wounded or killed, demonstrated bravery while under heavy fire, continued duties after being wounded, retrieved the flag after a previous flag bearer was killed, and carried it forward. Moment of silence. After 4 years, the Confederates surrendered. The Civil War put an end to chattel slavery. It also made clear that the country was not a collection of semi-independent states, but an indivisible whole. Juneteenth. Federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 16, 1865, to take control of the state and enforce that all enslaved people were freed. Texas was the last state of the Confederacy with chattel slavery. Emancipation for the remaining enslaved in the two Union border states of Delaware and Kentucky did not come until several months later, on December 18, 1865, when the signing of the 13th Amendment was announced. Juneteenth was made a federal holiday on June 17, 2021. Cotton produced by the labor of enslaved African Americans was so profitable, it led to a costly civil war and the loss of over 600,000 lives to end it. Even throughout complex times in history, African Americans have always managed to persevere. Understand our history. Understand ourselves. Understand our future. Subscribe.